When an avoidant comes back after months of no contact, it never feels casual and it never feels small. It feels like a shockwave that hits your chest before your mind can even process what's happening. One moment you're living your life, maybe finally breathing again after all the hurt, and then suddenly there's that message, that name, that person who disappeared without warning standing at the doorway of your peace, and your heart doesn't know if it should collapse, rage or hope. Because deep down, even after everything, a piece of you still remembers how it felt when they were close enough to touch, and another part of you remembers how it felt when they vanished like you never existed at all. But what people don't understand is that when an avoidant finally circles back after months of silence, it's not random, it's not accidental, it's not because they suddenly became brave or healed or ready. It's because something inside them, something they've spent a lifetime running from, finally caught up. Avoidants don't return because they woke up one morning and thought, I might lose this person forever. They return because that possibility finally became real, and it rattles them in a way nothing else does. They've spent months convincing themselves that silence was safety, that distance meant control, that burying their emotions would make the connection easier to forget. They told themselves you were fine without them. They told themselves they didn't need you. They told themselves they were better off alone. But the truth is, they never fully let go. They just pushed the feelings so far into the background that even they couldn't hear them, until the silence became louder than the connection ever was, until the quiet started echoing with everything they tried not to feel. The months of no contact weren't empty for them the way people assume. Yes, they weren't reaching out. Yes, they acted unaffected. Yes, they stayed distant and cold and logically detached. But inside they were fighting a silent storm. Avoidants don't process emotions like everyone else. They don't feel the breakup when it happens. They feel it later, sometimes much later, when the emotional dust finally settles and the adrenaline of running wears off. And that's when the thoughts they tried to bury start rising again. That's when the memories come back in fragments that sting. That's when they begin to sit with the truth they avoided. You were a safe place they didn't know how to stay with, and now they don't know how to get back to. They didn't disappear because you weren't enough. They disappeared because they felt too much and didn't know what to do with any of it. For an avoidant, intimacy feels like standing in front of a mirror with the lights too bright, every flaw, every fear, every insecurity exposed. They weren't running from you. They were running from the version of themselves they became when they were close to you, open, vulnerable, emotionally visible. That kind of closeness terrifies someone who has spent years building emotional armor. And the moment they felt themselves softening, the moment they sensed the relationship deepening, the moment they noticed they cared more than they planned to, their instinct wasn't to talk, it was to flee. Not because what they felt was wrong, but because what they felt was real. And real is the one thing avoidants never learned how to hold without shaking. But distance is their comfort zone. Distance is familiar. Distance is manageable. Distance gives them room to breathe without feeling watched or needed or exposed. And so the first true reason they come back after months of no contact is because the space finally became safe enough. Avoidants don't process closeness in real time. They process it in hindsight. When months pass, the emotional intensity fades just enough for them to look at what happened without feeling overwhelmed. They're not returning because they are suddenly ready for intimacy. They're returning because time softened the fear that pushed them away. With distance, the pressure lowers. The emotional intensity that scared them dissolves. And in that softened state, they start remembering the connection instead of reacting to it. But there's something else, something people don't talk about, that pulls them back: your silence. The shift that happens when you stop reaching out, stop checking in, stop trying to understand them, stop waiting for them to come home emotionally. Avoidants convince themselves that you will always be there, that you will always care, that your emotional door will always remain unlocked. They assume it because that's how their patterns work. Push away, then return when the fear settles. But when months pass, and your energy changes, and the familiar pull they expected from you is gone, it wakes something inside them that feels almost like panic, though they won't admit it. Their mind starts asking questions they don't know how to silence. What if you really moved on? What if the connection they once trusted to be unwavering no longer belongs to them? What if the absence they created became permanent? That's the second true reason they return. The power dynamic finally shifts. Your silence becomes the one thing they can't control. And ironically, the moment they realize you're not chasing, not waiting, not anchoring the connection anymore, is the moment they begin to feel the loss they avoided. Avoidants don't miss people who stay, they miss people who let go, because letting go triggers the one fear they bury beneath all their emotional armor, abandonment. And that fear, once activated, becomes louder than their need to protect themselves. Then something else begins to happen, quietly, privately, unexpectedly. They start noticing the emptiness, not the loud dramatic kind, but the subtle emptiness that creeps in during the small moments, waking up in the morning and not seeing your name, going through their day and not feeling the comfort of knowing you're still there, coming home to silence that used to feel peaceful but now feels unsettling. Avoidants don't miss the chaos of closeness, they miss the calm of your presence. They miss the emotional stability you brought without realizing it. They miss the version of themselves that felt seen, even when they weren't ready to be seen fully. They don't come back because they're lonely. They come back because the life they return to after pushing you away feels hollow compared to the emotional warmth you gave, even in the simplest moments. And then life. Life always has its timing. A song, a place, a memory, a scent, a moment they didn't expect. Something reminds them of you. Not in a dramatic movie-style way, in the quiet way that catches them off guard, in the way that makes them pause, in the way that brings back the emotional safety they didn't know they were missing. And avoidants don't know how to sit with emotional memories without reacting. That's when the urge to return begins. Not always because they worked through their fears, sometimes simply because the reminder cracked the armor they built. But there's something even deeper. The emotional low that creeps in when they're exhausted from pretending they don't feel anything. Avoidants are experts at distraction, work, routine, hobbies, friends, anything that keeps them from sitting still long enough to feel the loss. But life always slows down eventually. And when it does, the emotional numbness they rely on begins to fade. That's when the truth seeps in. Pushing you away didn't erase the connection, it only postponed the grief. And so months later, when everything inside them finally slows enough to feel again, they come back. Not because they're ready, not because they've changed, not because they suddenly understand intimacy, but because something inside them, something they thought they could outrun, finally whispers the truth they tried to ignore. You mattered, more than they allowed themselves to show, more than they allowed themselves to feel at the time, more than their fear could hide forever. And when that truth becomes louder than their avoidance, when the possibility of losing you becomes real instead of hypothetical, when their own silence finally feels heavy instead of protective, they reach out, not because you were easy to leave, but because you were impossible to forget. And so when they finally reach out, after all the silence, after all the distance, after all the months where you questioned your worth, your value, your meaning, it's never a simple message. Even if the words look simple on the surface, the weight behind them is enormous, because an avoidant does not return without something shifting inside them. And that shift often begins with the realization they never expected to confront. Their life, without you in it, feels emptier than they were prepared to admit. This is where the next true reason emerges, the quiet acknowledgement that the world they created after they left you behind isn't as fulfilling as they imagined. They might pretend they moved on. They might act like the breakup didn't touch them. They might even convince themselves for a while that pulling away was the right choice. But months later, when the distractions fade, when the routines lose their shine, when the emotional numbness wears off, they begin to feel the emptiness. The silence that once felt peaceful turns into a kind of loneliness that scratches at the walls of their mind in ways they can't ignore. It's not the kind of loneliness that comes from being physically alone. It's the loneliness that comes from the absence of emotional connection, especially the kind they only ever felt with you. Avoidants don't realize what someone means to them in moments of closeness. They realize it in moments of distance, and the longer the no-contact period stretches, the more undeniable that realization becomes. They may see someone walking with a partner, and it hits them. Or they may hear a song and feel something twist in their chest. Or they may sit in a room that used to feel comforting, but now everything feels slightly off, like something important is missing, and they can't pretend otherwise anymore. These moments don't break them open all at once. Instead, they unravel them slowly, gently, insistently. And then comes one of the most powerful reasons they return, the truth that they always believed you would still be there. In their mind, disappearing didn't mean losing you, it meant pausing you. They assumed you would wait. They assumed your heart would still orbit theirs. They assumed the emotional loyalty you showed would remain unchanged, no matter how much time passed. But then something happens that shakes them. They realize you may have moved on. Maybe you became quieter. Maybe you stopped checking their social media. Maybe your energy shifted. You're glowing differently, living differently, carrying yourself in a way that no longer clings to the memory of them. Avoidance can sense when the emotional tether they took for granted begins to loosen, even if you're silent, even if you're gone. And that awareness triggers something deeper than fear: regret. Not the regret of losing a relationship, but the regret of realizing they lost the only person who ever made emotional intimacy feel less terrifying. This regret comes slowly. It builds in layers. It often begins with a simple thought: did I ruin this? And from there it snowballs into something heavier. What if I can't get that connection back? That question repeats in their mind until it becomes an aching truth they can't outrun. But the next reason they return is perhaps the most shocking: the moment something in their daily life reminds them of you. Sometimes people underestimate how powerful these emotional triggers are. It could be a small thing, a joke only you two understood, a food you loved, a show you watched together, a place you once visited. These reminders hit avoidants harder than they admit, because their emotional memories don't fade. They get stored underground, buried beneath layers of avoidance, until the right moment cracks them open. And when these memories surface, they don't just bring back nostalgia, they bring back the feeling of safety they experienced with you, a feeling they didn't know how to appreciate at the time. Avoidants aren't triggered by big dramatic memories. They're triggered by the small, intimate ones, the ones that remind them you were home in ways they weren't ready to accept. And once those memories begin resurfacing, they find themselves thinking about you more often than they want to admit. They try to push the thoughts away, but they come back. They try to distract themselves, but the reminders keep appearing. And eventually they reach a point where pretending they don't care becomes more exhausting than acknowledging the truth. They miss you. And then comes the emotional low, the moment avoidants finally hit the wall they've been avoiding. Avoidants tend to collapse inward. They push themselves until they emotionally burn out. They carry everything alone. They refuse to lean on people. They convince themselves they don't need support, comfort, or connection. But everyone reaches a breaking point, and when they do, the mind goes searching for the last place it felt safe, understood, and emotionally grounded. For them, that place was you. This emotional dip doesn't come from weakness. It comes from the exhaustion of running from their own heart for too long. And when they reach that point, they begin to crave something they never fully allowed themselves to accept: emotional reassurance. Not from anyone, but from the one person who saw them clearly without judging them, who held space for them without demanding too much, who loved them in a way they didn't know how to handle at the time. That's when the urge to return becomes overwhelming. It's not just longing, it's not just missing you, it's the realization that you were the emotional anchor they didn't appreciate until they drifted too far away. And once that emotional need rises to the surface, it becomes stronger than their instinct to avoid, stronger than their fear of intimacy, stronger than their desire for independence, and in that vulnerable moment, they reach out. But here's what most people never understand: when an avoidant comes back, it doesn't mean they're healed. It doesn't mean they've had a breakthrough. It doesn't mean they suddenly understand commitment or know how to express their emotions. What it does mean is that the internal pressure, longing, regret, and emotional triggers finally outweighed the fear that kept them silent. The next reason they return is deeply tied to this. They convince themselves that they can come back without consequences. Avoidants are used to patterns where they push someone away, return later, and the person welcomes them back with open arms because the emotional bond is still strong. They rely on emotional elasticity, believing that no matter how far they stretch the connection, it won't snap. So when months pass and they feel a pull toward you again, they assume that the door is not only still open, but waiting. They don't consciously intend to take advantage of you, but they do unconsciously rely on your heart. They believe the love you gave them is something they can return to without needing to explain, without needing to take accountability, without needing to confront the reasons they disappeared. In their mind, the connection has only been paused, not broken. But what they don't realize is that during those months of silence, you changed, you evolved, you grew, you learned how to live without the emotional weight of missing them. And because of that, when they come back, the dynamic is different. You're no longer standing in the same place where they left you. And that shift, your new strength, your clarity, your boundaries, is something they can feel even before you speak a single word. And so by the time they send that message, by the time they decide to return, by the time they choose to break their silence, they're not just reaching out because they want you back. They're reaching out because something inside them has softened, cracked, awakened. Months of avoidance, running, and emotional detachment have finally worn thin, and now they're standing at the edge of their own fear, trying to decide whether the risk of reaching for you is worth the possibility of losing you forever. The truth is, it is worth it to them. That's why they do it. That's why they come back. That's why they choose vulnerability in a moment where they used to choose escape. Because deep in their heart, beneath all the walls and fears and survival patterns, they cared. They always cared. They just didn't know how to show it. And now, for the first time in a long time, the fear of losing you has become stronger than the fear of loving you. And so when they finally allow themselves to cross the line between silent longing and actual action, something profound happens inside them, something they will never say out loud, something they will try to hide behind casual words or a simple, "Hey, how have you been?" But underneath their calm surface, underneath that familiar emotional distance, something is shaking. Because reaching out for an avoidant is not small, it is not easy, it is not effortless. For them, it is the emotional equivalent of standing at the edge of a cliff and stepping forward without knowing if someone will catch them on the other side. This is where the next chapter begins, the moment their emotional processing finally catches up. And avoidants don't process pain, loss, or love the way others do. They don't feel the breakup when it happens. They don't feel the absence when they walk away. They don't feel the longing when the silence begins. They feel everything later, in slow motion, like their heart is a delayed echo of their reality. Months after the no contact, months after the distance, months after they convinced themselves they were fine. That's when it hits them. The realization that the connection they lost wasn't casual. The recognition that the relationship meant more than they allowed themselves to believe. The awareness that you touched parts of them they spent years protecting. They begin to see the moments they took for granted, the kindness they overlooked, the emotional safety they dismissed as too much, the closeness they misinterpreted as pressure. Avoidants don't understand the relationship until it becomes a memory. They don't understand the loss until it becomes a void. They don't understand the love until it becomes the silence they can no longer ignore. And this slow processing becomes the next true reason they return. They finally see the connection clearly, without fear muting their emotions, without pressure clouding their judgment, without the need to escape drowning out the truth. They start to understand that the connection wasn't overwhelming, their own unhealed wounds were. They start to see that you weren't asking for too much, they were offering too little. They start to realize that the intimacy they avoided was actually the one thing they always wanted, but never believed they could handle. This realization doesn't hit them as a soft whisper. It hits like a slow-burning ache, a discomfort that keeps growing until it becomes undeniable. And once they begin processing the relationship rather than avoiding it, their next emotional shift begins: regret. This regret does not appear like a dramatic meltdown. It shows up quietly, subtly, persistently. It shows up when they remember something kind you did. It shows up when they scroll back through old messages. It shows up when they sit alone in the evening and suddenly feel something missing. It shows up when they notice that no one else understands them the way you did. This regret becomes the ninth true reason they come back. The moment their regret becomes louder than their fear, avoidants spend their entire lives prioritizing emotional safety over emotional connection. But you were the exception. You were the one person who didn't demand more than they could give. You were the one person who didn't try to change them. You were the one person who offered love without suffocating them. And now, in hindsight, they begin to understand how rare that truly was. Regret isn't just sadness. Regret is clarity. Regret is truth finally breaking through their emotional defenses. And once that truth arrives, once they understand what they lost, they begin to feel something even more powerful, the fear that they pushed away someone irreplaceable. This fear is not the fear of loneliness. It's the fear of losing the one connection that felt real, even if it scared them. But then comes something they won't admit, the belief that they can come back without consequences. This is a deeply ingrained pattern for avoidance. They rely on emotional elasticity, the belief that the connection will always stretch to fit their distance. They believe you will always understand, always forgive, always hold space, always wait. They convince themselves that time can't change the emotional bond. They tell themselves that even after months of silence, you'll welcome them back because your heart was always open. It's not arrogance. It's not manipulation. It's the only relationship dynamic they've ever known. Avoidants assume that if the connection was real, it will survive anything, even their absence, and so when they finally return, they often do it with a quiet expectation that little has changed. But what they don't see coming is the shift inside you, the strength you built during the silence, the clarity you gained during the pain, the self-worth that grew from being forced to let go of someone who couldn't fully choose you. But before they see that, something else happens, something that often marks the exact moment an avoidant begins thinking about reaching out. They check your social media. This is the silent reconnection, the invisible bridge, the first sign their emotional defenses are cracking. Avoidants don't reach out immediately. Before they say anything, they observe. Before they speak, they scan. Before they risk rejection, they study you from a safe distance. They look to see if you're still there emotionally. They look to see if you're hurting without them. They look to see if you've moved on. They look to see if someone else has taken their place. And if they see you living your life, smiling, growing, glowing, healing, something inside them shifts. It's not jealousy in the dramatic sense. It's a deeper, quieter panic, the fear that the connection they believed they could return to has already slipped out of their hands. They begin to wonder if they waited too long. They begin to question if disappearing was worth it. They begin to feel the loss they tried so hard not to feel. This social media check becomes the emotional doorway. And from there their mind begins wrestling with itself, the side of them that wants connection and the side of them that fears it. And in this internal tug-of-war, another truth surfaces. Avoidants often come back when they sense that you have changed. Your silence becomes powerful. Your healing becomes magnetic. Your growth becomes the trigger for their emotional awakening. They return because something in you shifted, an energetic pull they didn't expect. When you stop chasing, the dynamic flips. When you stop trying to fix them, they begin to wonder what they've lost. When you stop making yourself emotionally available, they begin to feel the consequences of their distance. And that's when the next true reason they return emerges, the moment they sense that you may have outgrown the version of yourself that tolerated their fear-driven behavior. And this terrifies them more than intimacy ever did. Avoidants are not afraid of losing people. They are afraid of losing people who make them feel safe. And that possibility becomes the spark that finally pushes them to return. By the time they reach out, they have already imagined losing you. They have already replayed the memories. They have already felt the regret. They have already confronted the fear. They have already realized you were more important than their silence admitted. And so when they come back, it is not because they want attention. It is not because they want validation. It is because they are finally, painfully, unmistakably aware that what they ran from was not danger, it was love. A love they didn't know how to receive at the time. A love that still echoes inside them, despite all the distance. A love they believed they could escape, until the months passed, and they realized they couldn't. And now we arrive at one of the most misunderstood moments in the entire avoidance cycle, the moment after they return, when the energy between you shifts in ways neither of you fully expected. Because something powerful happens when an avoidant reaches out after months of silence. They're not just responding to their own internal changes, they're responding to yours. Avoidants don't come back when you're desperate. They don't come back when you're waiting. They don't come back when you're hurting or begging. They come back when your energy has softened in a different way, not softened toward them, but softened toward yourself. When you're no longer clinging, when you're no longer chasing, when you're no longer holding on to the version of yourself who believed you had to fight for the love you deserved. That's when they feel the shift. That's when they feel the absence. That's when your emotional freedom becomes the signal they never expected to experience. They are losing the emotional safety they once took for granted. This is the 16th true reason avoidants return. They come back after you heal, not because your healing makes you unreachable, but because your healing makes you whole. And whole people feel different. Whole people vibrate differently. Whole people carry their worth in silence, not in pleading. Your healing becomes a mirror. It shows them what you offered. It shows them what they ran from. It shows them the love they didn't know how to hold. When you stop giving your emotional energy away, they suddenly feel the void where your presence used to be. And that void feels louder than the fear that once kept them distant. Avoidants don't come back to reclaim you. They come back because they finally see the version of you they never appreciated, the strong, grounded, emotionally generous version of you who no longer needs them, but once chose them wholeheartedly. And now, we reach the part most people misunderstand, what their return actually means, and what it absolutely does not. When an avoidant reaches out after months of no contact, people automatically jump to one of two extremes. Either they've changed and want a future, or they're coming back for selfish reasons. But reality is more complex, more human, more emotionally layered than that. Their return does not automatically mean they are healed. They can now handle consistent intimacy. They understand the relationship's depth. They've overcome all their fears. They're suddenly ready for commitment. Because healing doesn't happen in silence, growth doesn't happen without accountability, and avoidants don't transform simply because time passed. But their return does mean something real, something vulnerable, something significant. You touched their heart deeper than they expected. They finally allowed themselves to feel the loss. The fear of losing you became stronger than the fear of loving you. They realized the connection mattered more than their ego. They reached a level of emotional awareness they weren't capable of before. Their return is not the finish line. It's the doorway. And whether that doorway leads to reconciliation or closure depends on one thing, whether they've returned with sincerity or with temporary discomfort. That brings us to the 18th section, how to know if their return is real or if it's just emotional recycling. Emotional recycling happens when someone comes back not because they want a relationship, but because they want relief. Relief from loneliness, relief from regret, relief from the emptiness that silence brought. Avoidants who come back for relief are inconsistent. They're emotionally hot and cold. They apologize vaguely but avoid depth. They ask for connection without offering effort. They want your presence but not your closeness. They mirror their past patterns, disappearing again the moment the emotional intensity rises. But avoidants who return with sincerity sound different, act different, move differently. They ask real questions. They show vulnerability. They show consistency. They acknowledge the distance. They take responsibility. They don't rush you. They don't expect you to fall back into old roles. And most importantly, they allow themselves to be emotionally uncomfortable without running from it. So then comes the question most people are too afraid to ask. What do you do when an avoidant comes back? Because this moment is not just about them. It's about you, your heart, your healing, your self-worth. And the answer is simple, yet deeply empowering. When they come back, you don't shrink. You don't forget what you learned in their absence. You don't abandon the version of yourself that grew stronger in the quiet. You don't lower your standards just because your heart still remembers them. You meet them where you are now, grounded, clear, steady, and self-aware. You don't have to be cold. You don't have to punish them. You don't have to close your heart, but you do need to stay rooted in your growth. You are allowed to listen. You are allowed to feel. You are allowed to hope, but you are not required to go backwards. Let them show consistency, not words. Let them show effort, not nostalgia. Let them rebuild trust at your pace, not theirs. Because the avoidance journey back to you is only meaningful if it aligns with your healing, not if it disrupts it. And now we arrive at the final section, the message your heart has needed to hear since the moment they disappeared. The truth that the silence made you question, the distance made you doubt, and the pain made you forget. You were never hard to love. You were never too much. You were never overwhelming. You were never the reason they pulled away. Their fear was not your fault. Their distance was not your flaw. Their silence was not a reflection of your worth. The avoidant did not leave because you were unlovable. They left because loving someone, truly loving someone, requires a kind of vulnerability they weren't ready to face. But your heart, your love, your loyalty, your tenderness, it was not wasted. It was not unseen. It was not forgettable. You changed them, even if they couldn't stay long enough to show it at the time. And now they return because the truth they spent months running from finally became louder than their fear. You were someone they could have loved deeply if they had only known how. But that truth belongs to them. Your healing belongs to you. And no matter what happens next, reconciliation or release, never forget this. Your worth is not measured by who comes back. Your worth is measured by the strength it took to survive when they left.